Hey, good morning. I believe where we left off in chapter 3 were the cultural traits amongst the Greeks, whether they lived in Greece proper or whether they lived in some of the colonies, which you will notice, by the way, if you look on your map on page 81 or somewhere around there, that they tended to have colonies along the coast. That makes perfect sense, right? Because they were a seafaring nation, a thessalocracy, as we learned earlier with the Mycenaeans. Okay, and what else did we learn about the Greeks? They put all this pride in guest friendships or in being friendly to even their opposition. And you've all heard of the Odyssey, the Iliad, which inspired, or which is the return of Homer after the Trojan War. Now, how did the Trojan War start? It actually began because of breach of guest friendship. It supposedly began when Paris violated the holy ties of hospitality. And how did he do that? By seducing the wife of Menelaus, and who he was going to visit, while he was a guest of that particular Spartan king. It also led to competition over the past, and this was a fledgling aristocratic clan. They started to fight with each other, and it led to our legendary hero of Homer. And of course, we know also about Greek culture, they liked heroes. And there was kind of this hero cult. There were sacrifices, observances at the tombs, but they did have this kind of heroic ideal, I guess you could say, in their culture. It became very ingrained in Greek society. And we see that in the Iliad, the Odyssey, which is, of course, the story, I believe I talked about this, of Homer's return home after many years in the Trojan War. And it was an odyssey, a whole experience for him to get home to his wife. Couple other things before I go on, and that is no matter where you lived on these islands or in the colonies, we discussed that there was Hellenism or Greek culture. Hero the hero cult, Greek language being spoken, Greek mannerisms, things like that. So there were a lot of other Greek, what should we call it? Greek traits that existed throughout the area. And whether it was, in Greece itself or in the colonies. And that we called Pan Hellenism. The other thing that we know about that is that most of this, let's just say the Odyssey, the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, was written down approximately 750 BCE. It became a cultural treasure, both the myth and the fact. And as I told you, some archaeologists and adventurers have actually tried to follow the route of Homer on his way home. But it now looks like it may possibly have been based on a true journey. Okay, let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to say. Oh, no matter where this Greek culture was in each of these societies, there appears to have been a different aristocratic leader. Different families, different aristocratic leaders. Perhaps they became the aristocracy and wealthy because they were traders, perhaps because they were farmers. Although in Athens, which is the central area we're talking about, which rose up sooner than other settlements after the destruction of the sea people, we're going to see different kinds of aristocracies. And that's going to be important from when we go on now. Now, this section is called The Rise of the Polis, and I believe I started this the other day. The polis means a polis is a city state. And obviously, it's one of the root words for politics. community, politics. And we know that the rise of the polis started as soon as Athens and the written word, it started to develop and solidify between 1000 and approximately 500 in what we're going to call archaic or ancient Greece. Okay, and each of the aristocrats or each of the islands seemed to have different characteristics. Some were tiny, some were large, and we're going to discuss three different poli, which is the plural of polis, today. And if you look at the other map called the Attic Peninsula on page 79, we will be able to look at the different poli that were all around the Attic Peninsula. And if you look at it, you'll see right in the middle was Athens. You're going to see many different, probably towns you've heard of, Thebes, Salamis, many of these different towns. And the rise of the polis probably was copied a little bit by, they probably learned a little bit about that by copying the Phoenicians. We don't really know. But at that point in time, the Phoenicians and the Greeks appeared to have more contact with each other through trade. The Greeks even adopted, as you recall, we discussed the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, and they also incorporated many of the artistic and literary traditions of the Near East. Remember, we went from the Middle East back now to the Greek Aegean Peninsula. And the Greeks were quite bright. They just incorporated the alphabet, the written tradition, seafaring into their own culture. The Greek ships, of course, hugged all the coast, as I told you. Look at that other map. The colonies seemed to hug the coastline all the way from, you can look at that, all the way from North Africa, the coast of Egypt, to Spain, southern Italy, Anatolia, all over. You can look at that. As we're going to see, as trade develops, as seafaring develops, as they begin to colonize, their culture in trade, in population, in the 9th to 8th century, that's going to be the 800s to the 700s, remember, the population quadrupled. And therefore the demands on the resources of that little Athenian state and all these other little Greek city-states is going to be intense. And remember, it's kind of craggy land. That probably was motivation for them going to colonize different areas around the Aegean that we do see. Okay. Now, what are the factors that led to the emergence of the Greek polis? Well, we talked about some of them: writing more, trading more, the expansion of the population, so we know they colonized. But also what's going to happen is the development of this community structure called the polis, the root of which we get the word politics. To the Greeks, no matter where they were, it was a collectivity rather than a state. And for this reason, when we talk about polis, we don't talk about it as a state like we do today. It's a group of people. For example, Thebes, if you look on that other map of the Attic Peninsula, they were called Thebans, that collective of that group of people. Then there were the Spartans, the Athenians, the Thebans, rather than the places where they were located. The individuals within that collective and the collective had a character. And as we know I talked about this before, they probably developed a citadel, an urban culture, the center of the urban culture, the workplace, which we're going to call the agora, probably the citadel was there, and then further out is the asti, the landscape around it, and even further out still was the chora, or the land where people probably lived and farmed, and perhaps it was subsistence, or we don't really know. Now, the residents of all of this group that we're talking about today is of Attic, the residents of the Attic Peninsula. It is going to be part of the group of Athenians. We're going to just call all of that Athens. We're going to study look at three different poli. Each are located in a different place, and you can look at the map and see where Athens is. Athens was probably the largest Cora and Asti and Agora. Therefore, the entire peninsula gets the name. We give it the name of Athens. It was also called the High City, with the Athenian Acropolis. So even though there were other communities, I think Athens was truly the center of the Attic Peninsula, and the place in which probably all the trade, the central market, everything took place. Okay, now step back for a second. We're familiar with Athens, and we know that these were an early agora, and one of the early larger towns, and of course the earliest to come back population-wise, etc. So the social structure that we're going to look at, the polis, and we've got those characteristics, we're going to look at three different poli. One is Athens. I know you've heard of Athens. There's even an Athens, New York. There are probably a ton of Athens somewhere. The Athenians, therefore, the Spartans from Sparta, we'll see them, and the Thebans. And if you look at Thebes, it looks like it's part of the peninsula, but it really isn't. It's quite north. It's not part of the peninsula, it's north. So Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. And I know you've heard of Athens, I know you've heard of Sparta, I don't know if you've heard of Thebes. But how do we know about this? Because the written word started to be used to report this history by our friend Herodotus. He sort of wrote the Athenian perspective. And remember, we talked about the Hebrew perspective in their Bible. But initially, it was Herodotus who spent a lot of his life in Athens, and the historian Thucidides, who lived from 460 to 395, and a guy named Xenophon, 430 to 354. Your book lists these. Then the philosophers Plato, I know you've heard of Plato, from 428 to 348, and his pupil Aristotle, I know you've heard of him, 384 to 322. These are the places and the individuals, historians and philosophers, we associate with what we call archaic Greece, from approximately 1000, as your book says, all the way to let's say 400 or 500. Plato and Aristotle are going to be sort of a part of Athens in its golden age. Okay, we discussed colonization, and as I said, you look at that, these Greek speakers still held to Greek traditions, guest friendship, hero cults. They hugged it's quite incredible to see how far their culture went, and this idea of pan-Hellenism, overall Greek technique. Now, your book does go into some of the discussion about lyric poetry, the fact that once they started writing, the Greeks wrote tremendous poetry. We call that lyric, like music, and much of it was in fact song initially. And there is some of that poetry on page 78. I also introduced to you the poetry of Sappho, who wrote about love, and she lived on the island of Lesbos. And if you look at page 86, there is something called the Song of Sappho, which was, in fact, more writing. Now, the assignment for this chapter, and I'll write it in your Moodle later, is going to be to find some Greek poet or poem. You can use Sappho, you can use the funeral oration by Pericles, which is beautiful. Supposedly it was recited after the Trojan War. About the experience that women went through. You can use the other poetry about guest friendship, which is found in your book. Or if you have trouble, please email me and I'll give you a piece. I want you to get in your homework page from Moodle, the media sheet, read your lyric poetry and describe. What are they talking about? Use the media sheet in order to do so. And then get it back to me as soon as you can. I will write it down on Moodle. Okay. I just wanted to say one more thing about Pan-Hellenism, which is kind of interesting, and I'm just looking for a date here. One of the interesting things about Pan-Hellenism is that in order to connect all these Greek communities throughout the region, every 4 years there were something called Panhellenic festivals. One of these were the Olympic Games, which had their origins right here. And of course, we still celebrate the Olympics, and it's of different nations competing with each other over athletic prowess, if you will, sporting events. And this is the origin, and you can running, throwing, probably distance running, other things, wrestling were all part, Greco-Roman wrestling later. Other things are going to be incorporated into that. Before I stop this particular tape, I want to discuss the other thing I'm sure you've heard about is the Delphic Oracle. Remember, even though there wasn't a great deal of, God talk, there were hero talk, and of course, many of the Greeks believed in oracles. They believed they would get a sign from the gods of what was right, what was wrong, which way they should proceed. And the most famous of those oracles is at Delphi. You can look at your map and find out where Delphi is. One other thing in terms of the culture, and your book goes into this, I'm not going to go into it right now, is that there was an ideal of male beauty. That could be because of the athletic prowess. That could be, when we talk about Sparta, you will know about that and their warrior culture. But the Greek word for kouros, which means young man or youth, is applied to a whole group of statues that were very realistic. You think of David, Michelangelo's David as very realistic. Well, look on page 82 and you'll see quite an incredible realistic sculpture from the Greeks at that time. That tells us they really loved youth, prowess, games, Olympic and warrior prowess. Also, if you look on page 83, there's even more cultural artifacts from the time the charioteer and racing his team at the Olympic Games. You'll see that. And on the next page, you'll also see, another pottery that also has a painting on it. So in this section, before I go on to talk about each of those poli in detail and what's interesting about them, what I'm going to do is just review. We talked about Greek culture. We talked about the spirit of friendship. We talked about lyric poetry, which I'd like you to find. and the fact that each of these poli, the polis, this collective of people, each had their own character. Okay, thank you. We'll discuss this further in a bit.